Almost nobody noticed when it happened, yet it quietly changed the future of the British monarchy. Hidden behind royal tradition is a little-known document that decides who can wield the king's powers if he cannot. And one of the people now entrusted with that authority isn't Prince William, it's Princess Anne. The reason why reveals just how vulnerable the monarchy has quietly become. So there is a piece of paper sitting inside Buckingham Palace right now that most people have never heard of, and it can decide who runs Britain if the king can't. Not the Prime Minister, not Parliament. A short list of royals, and one name on that list might surprise you. Princess Anne, because in December 2022, without a coronation, without a vote, without most of the country noticing at all, Anne quietly became someone who can sign laws, receive ambassadors, and act with the full authority of the crown. And the story of how she got there says more about the fragility of the modern monarchy than almost anything else that's happened under Charles. Here's where it starts. Every monarchy on earth eventually asks the same uncomfortable question: what happens if the person at the top can't do the job? Britain answered that question in 1937, and it answered it in a way that stayed almost untouched for nearly 90 years. That year, Parliament passed the Regency Act, and buried inside it was a mechanism most people only ever hear about when something goes wrong. It created a role called Councillor of State. The idea was simple on paper. If the monarch is temporarily absent from the realm or experiencing an illness that doesn't amount to legal incapacity, a number of councillors of state act on the monarch's behalf. Think of it as a limited power of attorney for the crown, not a coronation, not an abdication, a stand-in arrangement built for exactly the kind of situation Britain is living through right now. And here's the part that makes this genuinely interesting. The law doesn't let the king handpick his backups. He doesn't get to choose the people he trusts most, the hardest working members of the royal family, or even the royals with the strongest public support. Personal preference plays no role whatsoever. By law, the councillors of state are simply the monarch's spouse and the first 4 people in the line of succession who are over the age of 21. That's it. No interviews, no approval process, no assessment of experience, judgment, or willingness to carry out the role. Just bloodline and age. On paper, that sounds like a neat, straightforward constitutional rule. It keeps politics out of the decision and removes any suggestion of favoritism. But rules that simple can create very complicated consequences when a royal family changes over time. Marriages break down, family relationships fracture, senior royals step away from public life, others move overseas or become deeply controversial. And that's exactly what happened under King Charles. Once you actually map out the line of succession, instead of assuming everyone is available and trusted, the list becomes far more awkward than most people realize. In fact, it exposed a constitutional problem that Buckingham Palace could no longer ignore, and solving it would ultimately place Princess Anne in one of the most powerful positions she has ever held. Go down the line of succession from King Charles, and the first 4 adults you reach are Prince William, Prince Harry, Prince Andrew, and Princess Beatrice. Add Queen Camilla as the monarch's spouse, and that gives you the full roster of councillors of state exactly as the law prescribed. No discretion, no royal approval, no opportunity for the king to substitute someone else. The legislation simply follows the order of succession. Now look at that list a little more closely. Only 2 of those 5 were active working royals. Prince Harry stepped back from royal duties in 2020 and relocated to the United States. Prince Andrew was effectively removed from public royal life following his association with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and a civil lawsuit alleging he sexually abused Virginia Giuffre, which he denied before later settling the case without admitting liability. Princess Beatrice, meanwhile, has never been a working royal. She occasionally represents the family at events, but she lives primarily as a private citizen with her own professional career. That left the monarchy in a surprisingly awkward position. On paper, several of the people legally authorized to exercise the king's constitutional powers were no longer carrying out official royal duties. One lived thousands of miles away. Another had withdrawn from public life. A third had never been part of the working royal team in the first place. None of this was the result of a constitutional crisis or a dramatic palace feud. Nobody had been stripped of their place in the line of succession, and the law itself had worked exactly as written. The problem was that a constitutional formula created in 1937 was now colliding with a very different royal family in the 21st century. The rules had stayed frozen in time, while the people those rules applied to had changed dramatically, and sooner or later, Parliament would have to decide whether the law should catch up with reality. So in November 2022, just 2 months after becoming king, Charles did something about it. He sent a formal message to Parliament, read aloud in the House of Lords by the Lord Chamberlain, asking for the law itself to be changed. His statement said the change would ensure the continued efficiency of public business when he's unavailable, such as while undertaking official duties overseas. What he was asking for wasn't to remove Harry or Andrew from the list, and this detail matters because it's the opposite of what you'd expect. Rather than remove them from the list of councillors of state, the proposal was to widen the pool of eligible royals so that the availability of Andrew and Harry would cease to be an issue. In other words, don't fire anyone, just make sure there are enough working royals in the pool that it doesn't matter if 2 of them can't be called on. The 2 names he put forward to join that pool, his sister Princess Anne and his youngest brother Prince Edward. A month after the King's request was read to the House of Lords, Anne and Edward officially became councillors of state, and the Regency Act was amended to make it possible. Here's the detail that gets missed in almost every retelling of this. Anne and Edward being added didn't erase Harry, Andrew or Beatrice from the list. If the amendment passed, the list of councillors of state would still include Harry and Andrew, as well as Anne and Edward, who had actually served as councillors before they were surpassed in the order of succession to the throne. That last part is worth sitting with. Anne and Edward had done this job before, decades ago, back when they were closer to the throne. Then younger generations were born, they got pushed down the succession list, and by law, they lost their eligibility. The 2022 change didn't invent new power for them. It restored a role they used to hold before the numbers game pushed them out. So this wasn't a coup. It wasn't Charles cutting anyone loose. It was Charles adding a safety margin because he could see the existing one was down to almost nothing. Now, what can a councillor of state actually do? Because this is where people's imaginations tend to run wild, picturing someone temporarily wearing the crown. It's nowhere near that dramatic. Councillors of state are authorized by letters patent to carry out specific functions. Normally, most of the official duties of the sovereign, like attending Privy Council meetings, signing routine documents, and receiving the credentials of new ambassadors. But, and this is important, there are hard limits written into the law itself. Certain core constitutional functions cannot be delegated at all. The king's role as monarch of the other Commonwealth realms and dissolving parliament, except on the king's express instruction. A councillor of state can't call an election, can't fire a prime minister on their own authority, can't act as head of state for Canada or Australia or Jamaica. They're not a substitute king, they're closer to someone holding the office open, signing what needs signing, so government doesn't grind to a halt while the actual monarch is unavailable, and it only kicks in with a minimum of 2 people acting together. 2 councillors of state were required to be present to be constitutionally sound. In May 2022, the then Prince Charles and Prince William attended the state opening of Parliament together on behalf of Queen Elizabeth II when she was too unwell to do it herself. That's the model, not a solo regent. A pair, minimum, acting jointly for a defined and revocable stretch of time. So why does any of this actually matter right now in 2026? The answer is simple. The emergency that the 1937 Act was designed to deal with stopped being a theoretical possibility and became a real constitutional concern. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles had been diagnosed with cancer after it was discovered during treatment for what had initially been described as a benign enlarged prostate. The palace confirmed that the king would temporarily step back from public-facing engagements while undergoing a schedule of regular treatments, although it deliberately chose not to reveal the specific type of cancer. Even now, that information remains private. Despite reducing his public appearances for a period, Charles continued carrying out many of his constitutional responsibilities behind the scenes, creating an unusual situation in which the monarch was still governing but with obvious limitations. That is exactly the kind of circumstance the Councillors of State system was created for. Within days of the palace's announcement, constitutional experts began asking questions that had rarely received serious public attention. Among the first was the Constitution Unit, a respected academic research centre that specialises in Britain's constitutional arrangements. Their concern was not about the king's prognosis or his personal health. It was about how the machinery of government would function if his ability to perform official duties became increasingly restricted. They raised the possibility of what they described as a soft regency. Unlike a formal regency, where a regent completely assumes the monarch's constitutional powers after Parliament declares the sovereign incapable of ruling, a soft regency occupies a constitutional grey area. The king would still remain the monarch, still capable of carrying out certain essential responsibilities, yet unable or unwilling to perform every ceremonial and administrative duty required of the crown. In that scenario, many routine responsibilities could quietly be delegated to councillors of state, while the sovereign retained the most important constitutional decisions. It's an arrangement that has never been formally defined in law, yet modern circumstances suddenly made it seem far less hypothetical than it once appeared. And for the first time in decades, the names on that list of councillors stopped being an obscure constitutional curiosity and became a matter of genuine national importance. And here's where the story becomes both reassuring and quietly revealing at the same time. On one hand, Britain remains a very long way from activating the full provisions of the Regency Acts. The legal threshold for appointing a regent is extremely high and exists for only the most serious circumstances. It requires a formal declaration that the monarch is incapable of carrying out the duties of the crown following a specific constitutional process involving senior officials. That is fundamentally different from the temporary use of councillors of state. When a monarch is only temporarily unavailable, whether through illness, overseas travel, or another short-term circumstance, 2 or more councillors of state can be appointed to carry out a limited range of constitutional functions on the king's behalf. A regency, by contrast, effectively transfers the monarch's constitutional authority to another person until the sovereign either recovers or the reign comes to an end. Based on everything Buckingham Palace has publicly confirmed, King Charles is nowhere near that threshold. He has continued meeting with the Prime Minister, approving legislation, holding audiences, and performing the core constitutional responsibilities expected of the sovereign, even while undergoing treatment. There is no public evidence suggesting that Britain is on the verge of needing a regent. But the other side of the picture is equally important. Modern constitutional systems are designed not only for extreme emergencies, but also for the difficult space in between, where a monarch remains fully sovereign yet cannot reasonably carry every ceremonial and administrative responsibility alone. That is exactly where the councillors of state become relevant. And thanks to the changes made in 2022, there are now 4 experienced working royals who can realistically be called upon to perform those duties: Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Anne, and Prince Edward. Legally, 7 people remain eligible to serve as councillors of state. In practical terms, however, only 4 are active senior royals carrying out official engagements on behalf of the crown. That isn't palace gossip or constitutional speculation, it's simply the reality created by the current line of succession and the working structure of the royal family. The law provides 7 names, but today's monarchy has only 4 who are both eligible and realistically available to answer the call. Now, let's focus on Princess Anne, because this is the part that genuinely surprises many people who assume influence inside the royal family follows titles or proximity to the throne. It doesn't. Anne is not the heir, nor is she even close. She currently sits 16th in the line of succession, making it virtually impossible that she will ever become monarch. By the usual measures people associate with royal importance, she appears to be far from the center of the institution. But constitutional reality tells a very different story. What matters inside the modern working monarchy is not simply where someone appears on the succession chart. It is whether they are experienced, trusted, consistently available, and capable of carrying out the crown's duties without attracting unnecessary controversy. By that standard, Princess Anne has built one of the strongest records in the entire royal family. The numbers make that impossible to ignore. In 2023, Anne carried out 447 official public engagements, more than any other member of the royal family. Even King Charles, despite being the sovereign, completed 425 engagements during the same year. Pause on that for a moment. The king's own sister, a princess who will never wear the crown and sits 16th in line to inherit it, performed more official duties than the monarch himself. That isn't a reflection of Charles avoiding work. As king, many of his responsibilities are constitutional meetings, state papers, audiences, and private duties that never appear in public engagement statistics. Instead, Anne's total demonstrates something else entirely: an extraordinary workload sustained over decades with remarkable consistency. Year after year, she has earned a reputation as one of the monarchy's most dependable working royals, quietly representing the crown across Britain and overseas without the attention that often follows younger members of the family. That record explains why her appointment as an additional Counselor of State made so much constitutional sense. It wasn't a symbolic reward for long service, nor was it simply an honorary recognition of seniority. Parliament was looking for experienced working royals who could realistically be trusted to carry out constitutional functions at a moment's notice. Anne had already spent decades demonstrating exactly those qualities. Her position on the line of succession was almost irrelevant. Her experience, reliability, and willingness to shoulder the workload mattered far more than the number attached to her place in the royal family tree. What's equally interesting is that Anne has never been particularly enthusiastic about another idea that has become fashionable in royal commentary: the so-called slimmed-down monarchy. For years, commentators have argued that the institution should become smaller, with fewer working royals carrying out official engagements in an effort to modernize the crown and reduce costs. Anne has publicly questioned that approach. She has said that the phrase slimmed-down monarchy never sounded especially convincing from her perspective, pointing out that the concept emerged at a time when there were significantly more working royals available to share the workload. From where she stood, reducing the number of people performing official duties always risked placing greater pressure on those who remained. Looking back, those comments now seem remarkably prescient. Over the years, the number of active working royals steadily shrank through retirement, changing family circumstances, personal decisions, and public scandals. What once looked like a manageable reduction eventually exposed an unexpected weakness in the constitutional system itself. By 2022, the monarchy discovered that its emergency backup mechanism had quietly become too dependent on people who were no longer carrying out royal duties. The solution was not to reverse decades of change, but to reinforce the institution with the people who were already doing the work. And no one embodied that more clearly than Princess Anne, whose value to the monarchy had long been measured not by her place in the succession, but by the sheer volume of responsibility she had willingly carried for decades. So here's the real shape of the story, without any embellishment, because the facts are unusual enough on their own. A law passed in 1937, written for a much smaller and far more predictable royal family, functioned perfectly well for generations. It was simple, automatic, and rarely attracted any public attention. The councillors of state were determined by a straightforward formula based on the monarch's spouse and the first 4 adults in the line of succession. And for decades, there was little reason to question whether that arrangement still made sense. Then, in the span of just a few years, the assumptions underpinning that system began to unravel. One senior royal stepped away from official duties and moved to the United States. Another was effectively removed from public royal life following his association with Jeffrey Epstein and a civil lawsuit alleging sexual abuse, which ended in a settlement without an admission of liability. A third had never been part of the working monarchy in the first place, instead pursuing a private career outside royal service. Yet through nothing more than birth order, all three remained legally entitled to serve as councillors of state if circumstances required it. That wasn't the result of a loophole or a constitutional mistake. It was exactly how the law had been written. At the time, it looked like a routine piece of constitutional housekeeping that attracted relatively little public attention. Yet history has a habit of giving ordinary decisions extraordinary significance. Barely 2 years later, King Charles announced that he had been diagnosed with cancer. Suddenly, the contingency plan Parliament had quietly reinforced no longer looked theoretical. Instead of relying on just 2 realistic working councillors of state, the monarchy now had 4 experienced senior royals ready to step in whenever the constitutional machinery required them. What seemed like a technical adjustment in 2022 would soon prove to be one of the most quietly important constitutional decisions of Charles's reign. There's an even quieter irony running beneath all of this. The entire purpose of the councillors of state system is to ensure the public never notices when the monarchy is under pressure. It exists so there is no visible interruption, no constitutional vacuum, and no moment where the machinery of the crown appears to hesitate. If the system is doing its job properly, almost nobody should realize it's there at all. In many ways, that's exactly what has happened. Throughout his treatment, King Charles has continued carrying out a remarkably full schedule of constitutional duties. He has held audiences with the Prime Minister, approved legislation, welcomed foreign leaders, hosted state events, and continued representing the Crown, even as his medical treatment has continued in the background. The institution has projected continuity, which is precisely what it was designed to do. At the same time, Buckingham Palace has been equally careful with the language surrounding the King's health. It has never announced that he is in remission. Instead, official statements have described his condition as entering a precautionary phase that will be continuously monitored and reviewed. Those 3 carefully chosen phrases reveal almost as much through what they avoid saying as through what they communicate. Reduced treatment, precautionary phase, continuously monitored. Each sounds reassuring on its own, yet none definitively declares the illness to be over. Together, they create a picture of cautious optimism, while deliberately leaving room for uncertainty. That careful wording reflects the balancing act the palace has tried to maintain from the beginning, offering enough transparency to reassure the public without making promises that medical reality may not support. And that is exactly why the councillors of state are no longer just an obscure constitutional curiosity buried in old legislation. They have become part of Britain's active constitutional safety net. The reforms passed in 2022 quietly strengthened that safety net well before anyone knew whether it would ever be needed. Now, with a monarch publicly managing a serious illness while continuing to perform the essential duties of the crown, those changes look far less like routine housekeeping and far more like careful constitutional preparation. Most people will probably never notice that the system is there. But if it ever has to step in, that will mean it has done exactly what it was designed to do. So no, nobody was stripped of power, and no, there's been no secret transfer of the throne. What actually happened is duller than the headlines that get written about it, and also more revealing. A 90-year-old law nearly broke under the weight of a modern family's scandals and choices, and the fix was hiding in plain sight the entire time. The King's sister, 16th in line and first in workload, quietly restored to a job she'd already done once before, decades ago, back when the numbers still worked in her favour. That's the real story, not a palace coup. A patch job on 89-year-old legislation, done in public, in Parliament, which somehow makes it more interesting than the version everyone assumes is happening behind closed doors.